50 years after leaving his childhood home, a retired veteran returns to the quiet A-frame by Flathead Lake, only to find his German Shepherd scratching at a wall that remembers more than it should. Beneath the blue paint lies the truth about a little girl who never left. If you love stories where silence finally speaks, hit like and subscribe to Follow Frank's Journey. The road into Flathead County wound through pine and fog. Frank kept one hand on the wheel, the other on Ranger's head as the wind carried the smell of rust and cold. 50 years since Frank had last driven this way, a scared 15-year-old boy in the backseat of a sheriff's car watching his childhood collapse in the rearview mirror. The A-frame cabin appeared through the trees like something preserved in amber-sharp roof cutting through the mist. It looked smaller now. Maybe he'd just grown too big for memories. He killed the engine, the sound fading into the sigh of the woods. Ranger jumped down first, sniffing the airtail held low. Frank followed boots sinking into the wet earth. The house smelled of pine and varnish, his father's workshop clinging to everything. He'd told himself this trip was practical. Clear out the old place, sell the land, close a chapter. But now, standing there, he felt something heavier in his chest. Home, he muttered, though the word didn't fit right anymore. The front door stuck for a second before giving way. Dust motes spun in the air like ghosts. He left the suitcase on the porch and stepped inside. The floorboards creaked a rhythm of childhood. Furniture sat where it had always been, the sofa under the window, the clock that hadn't ticked since 1971. And above the mantel, the family photo, his father, his mother himself at 10, and Annie, 7 years old, holding her rag doll tight. Frank looked away before the memories could rise. Ranger moved through the house like a soldier clearing a room, methodical, alert. The dog stopped at the foot of the narrow staircase at the back and froze ears forward, head tilted. Frank followed his gaze. The door at the top of the stairs was painted pale blue, the paint flaking near the handle. He hadn't seen it open since the night Annie disappeared. His mother had locked it after the police finished their search and had never allowed it to be touched again. A part of him had been glad. Behind that door was everything they'd lost. Not today, Frank whispered, though he wasn't sure who he was talking to, the dog or the house itself. Ranger whined softly, pressing his nose against the crack between door and frame. Frank noticed the lock, newer than the rest of the hardware, not rusted, not even dusty. Someone had replaced it. His brow furrowed. Nobody had lived here since his mother's death a decade ago. He reached for the knob, hesitated, then let his hand fall. The air in that hallway was colder, stiller. He turned the key, once hearing the soft click but didn't push the door open. He backed away, muttering, "It's just a room, boy." Nothing left in there. But Ranger stayed lying down in front of the door paws, crossed head, resting on them, eyes never leaving the blue paint. That night, Frank built a small fire in the stone hearth. The flame's light flickered across the walls, turning the old family photographs into ghosts. He sat on the couch with a glass of bourbon, the same brand his father used to drink, and listened to the house breathe timber-popping, wind-scraping shingles. He'd spent his whole adult life trying to forget this place, and yet here it was, waiting for him, unchanged patient. Ranger lay by the fire, but every so often the dog's head would lift ears, pricking toward the hallway. Once he gave a low growl that seemed to rise from somewhere deep. Frank set down his glass. "You too, huh?" he said softly. "Can't sleep around here either." He stood, walked to the window. The lake beyond the trees caught the moonlight, still and silver. The reflection shimmered like something alive, something watching. He looked back down the hallway once more. The blue door glowed faintly in the firelight, as if the color itself remembered something he didn't. He told himself he'd deal with it in the morning. Call the locksmith, clear out the room. Get this over with. He turned away and caught his reflection in the dark window, not his own, but his father's, with the faint blur of a child's hand behind him. Frank blinked, and the image was gone. Ranger barked once, sharp and sudden, breaking the silence. "It's nothing," Frank said aloud, "just the past settling." But even as he said it, he felt the lie in his throat. The past didn't settle, it waited. Morning came thin and gray, the kind of light that doesn't wake you so much as remind you you've survived another night. Frank brewed coffee on the old stove, the burner rattling like it always had. Ranger sat by the door, eyes on the hallway where the blue room waited. Frank ignored him and focused on the smell of the coffee, on the small, normal things that made a man believe he was still in control. He told himself he'd clean-call the realtor and leave, but houses have a way of holding people the same way they hold heat. He found himself in the living room where dust clung to the curtains like fog. He began stacking old newspapers, sorting photo frames, moving boxes his mother had left untouched. When he reached the mantel, his hand froze. There it was, the family photograph. The one from 1971. His father's hand on his shoulder. His mother's smile tight but polite. Annie standing in front, clutching that rag doll she carried everywhere. Frank had seen this picture all his life, but not like this. The light caught it differently now. He leaned closer. Annie wasn't smiling. Her mouth was open as if about to speak, and on the wall behind her a glint, a faint reflection. A sliver of brightness that looked exactly like the narrow crack of a door left ajar. The blue door. He blinked, stepped back. The photo frame slipped from his hand and hit the floor glass, cracking down the middle, splitting the image clean through Annie's face. Ranger jumped at the sound and patted over, nose to the frame. "It's just a photo," Frank muttered, but his voice lacked weight. He picked it up, ran a thumb over the tear in the glass, then set it aside. He told himself it was nothing, just a trick of memory of light. But his hands wouldn't stop trembling. He cleaned through the afternoon trying to outrun the unease. Every creak of the floor sounded like footsteps upstairs. Every gust through the chimney whispered in the same pitch as a child breathing. When the knock came, he nearly dropped the coffee cup. A woman's voice followed, thin but cheerful. "Frank Dalton." It's been years. He opened the door. Mrs. Reed stood on the porch wrapped in a heavy cardigan, her white hair pulled tight. She had been old even when he was a boy. Now she seemed carved out of the same weathered wood as the porch itself. "Heavens," she said, squinting. "You look just like your daddy." Frank smiled politely, though the comparison made his stomach tighten. She looked past him into the house, eyes landing on the blue door down the hallway. Still locked, she asked quietly. "Guess some things never change." Frank stepped aside and let her in. She walked with small, deliberate steps, glancing at the photographs, the furniture. "I used to watch your mama water the flowers here every morning," she said. "And after she passed, I'd sometimes see a soft light in that blue room at night, like something was reflecting from the lake. I thought maybe you'd rented it out." Frank turned sharply. "That's impossible. Nobody's been here in years." Mrs. Reed shrugged. She smiled faintly. Old habits die slow. Maybe ghosts watch the Late Show now. Frank tried to laugh, but it came out thin. "Maybe wiring's bad. House like this could power itself by memory." Mrs. Reed's gaze softened. "You know, your daddy worked himself half to death fixing this place after Annie. Came out here every night for weeks with his tools. Hammering, sanding, painting. Like he could build over sorrow if he just kept busy enough." She reached out, touched his arm. "He loved her, Frank. Don't let folks tell you otherwise." He nodded, unsure what to say. She left soon after, her footsteps fading down the gravel road. When the door shut, the house felt larger. He walked to the hallway. The blue door stood there, silent, patient. He touched the knob lightly. It was cool, smoother than it should have been for 50-year-old metal. Ranger moved beside him, tail low, pressing close. The dog's nose twitched once, twice, then he sat and let out a quiet sound, a half-whine, half-growl. Frank knelt, fingers brushing the dog's fur. "You smell something." Ranger's eyes met his, unblinking. Frank listened. Somewhere beyond the walls, maybe from the upstairs vent, came a faint hum. He strained to hear. It wasn't the wind. It wasn't the old wiring. It was rhythmic, almost steady. A soft electric sound. Like static, or maybe a low, continuous tone of a light that had never really gone out. The house held its breath after sunset. The lake outside had gone black. the trees whispering as the wind moved through them. Frank had shut every light except the one in the kitchen where he sat with the second cup of coffee that had gone cold an hour ago. He kept telling himself he'd sleep soon, but his eyes kept drifting to the hallway to the faint shadow of the blue door at the far end. Ranger was restless, pacing from window to door and back again, nails ticking softly against the wood. The air felt heavier as night deepened, as if the walls were soaking up sound. Somewhere upstairs a plank popped sharp and hollow. Old house, Frank muttered half to himself. But Ranger stopped pacing. His head lifted, ears pricked forward. Then the sound came again, slow, deliberate. Not the pop of wood expanding, not the groan of settling beams. It was a scrape. A dragging noise. From the wall beside the blue room. Ranger growled low and deep before lunging down the hall. His claws clattered against the floor as he threw himself at the wall, barking, once sharp enough to make Frank's heart stutter. Frank grabbed the flashlight and followed, pulse pounding. "Easy, boy," he said, voice tight. The dog ignored him, pawing at the baseboard, tearing at the wallpaper with frantic insistence. Dust floated up in clouds. Frank knelt, shining the beam across the wall. The wallpaper peeled back to reveal raw wood, pale and scarred. Ranger's breathing filled the silence rough and fast. Then Frank saw tiny grooves carved into the wood grain. Not random scratches from rats or nails. Lines deliberate, clustered low to the floor, each one shallow, uneven. He leaned closer. There were 5 parallel marks, then a space, then 5 more, and again, as if someone with small hands had clawed there until they couldn't any more. His throat tightened. The flashlight trembled in his grip. He crouched lower, tracing one groove with a fingertip. The wood was smooth with age, but the shape was clear. Fingernails. Human. Small. Ranger whimpered now, his body pressed against the wall, nose to the scratches. Frank whispered, "Easy. It's old. It's just old marks." But even as he said it, he knew better. He raised the light higher. The beam caught something faint above the scratches, letters uneven, carved in jagged strokes. They'd been painted over layer upon layer until only a ghost of them remained. He squinted, following each curve, each line. Slowly, the words took shape. "Don't tell Dad, don't tell Mom, it hurts." The letters were crooked, childish, trembling. The paint around them had cracked where moisture had seeped through the edges, soft as if the wall had tried to swallow the confession. Frank's stomach twisted. He stepped back, leaning against the opposite wall, staring at the message as if it might vanish if he blinked. Ranger sat beside him, silent now, chest rising and falling fast. The house seemed to hum around them, a low vibration like the echo of something long buried trying to be heard again. He wiped a hand across his mouth, mind racing. Annie had been 7. The words looked like they'd been carved by someone that age. The scratches below the writing, the ones that stopped halfway, suddenly made sense. She'd been trying to write, or reach, or escape. He pictured her small hands against the wood the room sealed. No one coming when she called. His heart thudded so hard it hurt. The words pulsed in his head. "Don't tell Dad, don't tell Mom, it hurts." What did it mean? Why hide it here behind paint? Why not scream, unless she had screamed and no one listened? Frank turned off the flashlight for a moment. The darkness pressed close, warm, and stale. He could hear his own breath, Ranger's panting, the creak of the floor beneath them. Then another sound. A faint ticking, steady rhythmic like something old settling behind the boards. He shone the light toward the ceiling, half expecting to see a leak. But there was nothing. The sound came from inside the wall. He pressed his ear to the wood. The ticking was soft, but clear, as if the wall itself remembered a sound it once held. He stepped back, forcing his voice steady. "Come on, boy. Enough for tonight." But Ranger didn't move. He stared at the wall, his tail stiff, and then let out a single low bark that sounded almost like a warning. Frank stood there for a long moment, the words on the wall burning in his vision even after he turned away. When he finally walked back to the living room, he left the flashlight on the floor, its beam still trained on that spot. In the faint glow, the scratches looked wet, like fresh cuts. Morning light crept in like a trespasser, sliding through cracks in the blinds and landing squarely on the wall Ranger had scratched. The words were still there, faint and quiet beneath the paint, but they didn't feel like history anymore. They felt like evidence. Frank hadn't slept. He'd sat up most of the night by the cold hearth, staring at the flicker of the flashlight beam still pointing down the hall. Ranger had finally dozed off near dawn, head on his paw's tail twitching in uneasy dreams. Now, as Frank rose, his knees stiff, his body heavy with memory, the air felt charged like the pause before a confession. He stood before the wall again, running his hand along the scratches. The wood was softer here, old pine warped by damp air. He crouched and pressed on one of the floorboards near the wall. It moved. Barely, but enough to notice. He pressed harder. The edge dipped, then lifted back as if floating on air. He fetched a screwdriver from his truck and knelt again, working at the nails until, one by one, they gave with small squeals. Dust puffed up with every lift. Ranger sat close eyes fixed on the board, as if he understood what lay beneath mattered more than anything else. When the plank came free, Frank leaned over the opening. Beneath the floor was a cavity no deeper than a foot crossbeam stretching across, like the ribs of a wooden skeleton. At first, it looked like nothing but dirt and splinters. Then he saw the stain. A dark mark across one of the beams, brown and dull, but too deep to be wrought. He reached down, scraping gently with his fingernail. The flake that came loose was dry, brittle, and rusty red. Blood, old, dried into the wood like time itself had tried to seal it in. His stomach clenched. He ran the beam of his flashlight along the edges of the cavity. The dark streak ran several inches uneven, like something had soaked into the floor and been quickly wiped away. A drop here, a smear there. It wasn't a clean spill, it was the chaos of movement. He sat back on his heels, trying to breathe past the weight pressing in his chest. His father had rebuilt this section of the house himself after police finished the surface search. He remembered the hammering late into the night, the smell of varnish. He'd thought it was grief, then a man repairing what time had broken. Now, he wasn't so sure. You knew he whispered not to the house, but to the ghost of his father that seemed to linger in every nail and beam. You knew what happened. Ranger nudged his elbow softly, breaking the spiral. Frank reached down to steady himself, and his fingers brushed something small and hard. It rolled between the planks with a faint metallic click. He reached again and pulled it free, a small round object no bigger than a dime, dulled by dust. At first, he thought it was a coin. Then he wiped it clean with his thumb, and letters appeared on its curved surface, AD. He froze. His breath left him in a short exhale. Annie Dalton. His little sister. He turned it over. It was a button brass engraved in the delicate style his mother used to sew onto Annie's dresses. He could almost see her twirling in the yard, the sun catching the small buttons that gleamed down her back. The police had listed her outfit the night she disappeared, blue cotton dress with brass buttons, initials monogrammed. The first one had been found on the porch steps. He'd heard the detail whispered at the station when he was too young to understand what it meant. He stared at the button in his palm, the small loop of thread still clinging to its back, frayed but unmistakable. This one had been torn loose, not fallen. He looked back at the bloodstain, the warped board, the childish scratches on the wall. The pieces clicked together with an awful simplicity. Annie hadn't been taken. She had been here, hurt, maybe calling for help no one heard, maybe hiding from someone she trusted. He leaned forward, pressing his forehead to his fist, and the floor beneath him felt suddenly alive, like it was breathing with him. He remembered his father's voice, the quiet authority of a man who could fix anything, furniture, fences, even feelings, if he had a hammer in hand. Some things we don't talk about, son. We just build over them. The words came back now, cold and cruel in their logic. Frank lifted the button again, holding it to the light, and felt the years collapse around him. Ranger whined, pawing gently at the edge of the hole. The wind pushed through the trees outside, rattling the shutters, a sound almost like footsteps moving just above them. Frank straightened slowly, eyes locked on the narrow seam where the wall met the floor. The place where the paint was slightly different, where repair met cover-up. He could almost hear the echo of a hammer there, each strike sealing something deeper than wood. The button lay on the table like a verdict, small and golden, reflecting the pale morning light that slipped through the curtains. Frank hadn't eaten. He'd spent hours pacing the narrow living room, replaying every word his father ever said about that night, how Annie must have wandered into the woods, how the search dogs lost the trail, how the sheriff eventually called it an abduction. Lies, all of them, or at least half-truths nailed together until they held the weight of a story people could live with. But the floorboards, the scratches, the button, they didn't lie. Ranger followed him from room to room, silent except for the occasional sigh, his amber eyes tracking every movement. By afternoon, Frank was back in the hallway, studying the patched baseboard where he'd found the button. The wood was newer there, smoother. His father's craftsmanship. Every fix hiding something. He turned toward the old dresser at the end of the hall, a heavy oak thing that had belonged to his mother. Dust had gathered thick along the handles. When he tugged one drawer open, the scent of lavender sachets and age spilled out. Letters, photographs, recipe cards. Beneath a folded stack of linen lay a thin leather-bound book, the cover worn soft as cloth. He lifted it carefully. Evelyn Dalton was written faintly in pen across the inside cover. His mother's handwriting, elegant, tidy, the same he'd seen on grocery lists, taped to the fridge when he was a boy. He sat on the floor back against the wall and began to read. The entries were short, practical. Notes about weather, about her garden, about meals she'd cooked. But then the tone shifted. The entry for June 14th, 1971. She fell through the loose board. David said she hit her head. I didn't see, I only saw the blood. Frank froze. His breath caught halfway. He read the line again slower. David said she hit her head, his father. The night Annie disappeared there had been hammering downstairs, voices raised. He'd thought it was part of the search neighbors helping repair the floor where police had torn up boards. But what if it wasn't repair? What if it had been covering something? The next entry was written 2 days later, shaky, the ink blotched as though the pen had trembled in her hand. He buried himself in work, keeps saying it was an accident. I want to believe him, I do. But the sound, it wasn't just a fall. It was a scream, sharp and small, and then silence. Frank's vision blurred. He ran a thumb down the margin, tracing his mother's neat handwriting that seemed to crack open under the pressure of guilt. He flipped further. Weeks passed between entries, each one smaller, shorter. The sheriff asked again. David didn't look up when he answered. The floor's fixed now. It's like it never happened. Then, near the end, a page torn jaggedly from the spine. The last surviving line trailed off mid-thought. If only he hadn't yelled at her first. The words stopped there, bleeding into nothing. Frank stared at them for a long time, heart pounding with an anger that didn't know where to land. His father had yelled. Over what? A spilled drink. A broken toy. Something so ordinary it didn't deserve to end a life. He pressed the journal shut, the leather soft and warm from his hands. The house was silent except for the faint hum of the refrigerator and the distant ticking of the wall clock that hadn't worked in years but still pretended to. Ranger shifted, laying his head on Frank's knee, a weight steady and real. Frank rubbed behind the dog's ear, whispering, "She knew, didn't she?" She knew it wasn't just an accident. Ranger gave a low, uncertain whine, the kind that wasn't fear but recognition. Frank stood and returned the journal to the dresser, sliding it beneath the folded linen where it had been hidden. But the words clung to him. If only he hadn't yelled at her first. The implication rooted deep. His mother hadn't written accusation, but she had written doubt. Maybe that was worse. Doubt seeps into a family until it becomes part of the house itself. He walked to the window. The lake outside was silver and still. A breeze moved through the pines, stirring the reflection into ripples. Somewhere out there, the sound of a hammer seemed to echo faintly, though there was no one working. He turned toward the hallway again, and for a fleeting moment, he thought he saw movement by the blue door. A flicker of light, like something shining through the crack beneath it. The wind shifted sometime in the afternoon colder than it should have been for late spring. Frank stood on the porch, hands braced against the railing, staring out toward the tree line. The air smelled faintly of rain and old wood smoke. The journal's words had been echoing in his head since morning, looping through him like a whisper that refused to fade. If only he hadn't yelled at her first. Every time he thought it, the sentence broke in half and left him with questions that scraped like gravel inside his chest. Ranger stood at the edge of the yard, nose lifted, tail still. Then he turned suddenly, moving toward the path behind the house, the one that led down to the old shed by the lake. Frank hesitated before following. The shed had always been his father's place off limits to children, heavy with the smell of turpentine and oil, filled with sawdust and half-finished furniture. As a boy, Frank used to press his ear to the door and listen to the rhythm of hammering, each strike steady and precise like a heartbeat made of iron. Now the path crunched under his boots as he followed Ranger's sure steps. The shed came into view, smaller than he remembered, but somehow more imposing, its tin roof sagging under years of pine needles. The padlock was gone, rusted off, or forgotten. The door groaned when he pushed it open, hinges complaining. Dust and the faint tang of metal filled the air. Light from a single cracked window cut through the gloom, falling across the workbench his father had built. Ranger went straight to it, sniffing at the legs, then pawing at the wood near the far corner. Frank stepped closer. The bench surface was scarred with decades of use, but near the center, one mark stood out, a deep circular dent surrounded by chipped paint. He leaned in. Embedded in the grain was a faint smear of color, dull now, but still visible. Blue, the same pale shade as the door in the hallway upstairs. He touched it, fingertips coming away gritty with dried pigment. It wasn't just a work stain, it was splatter. He looked around the room at the jars of nails and brushes, the old toolbox, the broken lamp in the corner. His father's tools were still lined up neatly on the pegboard, each one hanging in perfect order, as if the man might walk in at any moment and reach for one without thinking. Frank's stomach turned. "You fixed everything, didn't you?" he said quietly. "Even this." Ranger's ears twitched at the sound of his voice, but didn't move from his place by the bench. The dog's nose pressed against a drawer near the floor, scratching lightly. Frank crouched, pulling it open. Inside was a stack of envelopes, yellowed and soft at the edges. Most were blank, some filled with old receipts, others with scraps of blueprints. And at the bottom, a single sealed envelope addressed in his father's careful hand, Reverend James Whitaker, First Baptist Church, Helena, Montana. The stamp bore the date May 1972. It had never been sent. The paper inside crackled when Frank unfolded it, the ink faded but legible. "Reverend, I can't live with what I did. I didn't mean to. She scared me when she screamed. Evelyn doesn't know the truth. I told her it was an accident, and maybe it was, but the sound won't leave me. Every time I close my eyes, I see her hand on the blue paint. I see her fall." Frank's hands began to shake. He read it again, slower, trying to hear the voice behind the words, the tone of a man broken open by what he'd done. "I didn't mean to." The phrase repeated in his head like a heartbeat. His father's anger had always been a quiet thing, sharp but controlled. Frank remembered the way his jaw would tighten before he spoke, how his words could slice even when his hands stayed still. He had never seen him strike anyone, but maybe that was the point. Maybe the strike that mattered wasn't meant to happen at all. Frank folded the letter back into its envelope and set it on the bench. His father's ghost seemed to fill the room, standing somewhere behind him, watching. He turned toward the far wall where old paint cans sat stacked. One was open just enough for the edge of the lid to show a thin crust of dried blue. He picked it up, the weight heavier than he expected. He pried the lid loose. Inside, the paint was hardened into ripples, a frozen sea of color that matched the walls upstairs exactly. He set it down, staring at it, the connection so painfully clear now that it made his chest tighten. The blue wasn't a color his father had chosen for beauty. It was the color of penance, the color of hiding. Outside, thunder rolled across the lake, low and distant. The air thickened, carrying the promise of rain. Frank stepped out onto the small porch of the shed, Ranger following close behind. The wind had picked up, bending the trees, stirring the reflection on the water until it broke apart. Somewhere in that restless movement he could almost hear it, the faint echo of a child's scream swallowed by the storm. The rain had stopped some time before dawn, leaving the earth damp and the air thick with the smell of pine and soil. Frank hadn't slept. He sat at the kitchen table, the unopened envelope between his hands, his father's words still echoing like a bell that refused to fade. "I didn't mean to. She scared me when she screamed." The truth was a wound that needed to be seen before it could close. Ranger paced by the back door, restless. When Frank finally opened it, the dog bolted into the yard, nose low tail, straight moving with purpose. The morning light caught the wet grass, turning it silver. "What is it?" Boy Frank called. But Ranger didn't look back. He was already headed toward the far corner of the property, where the trees grew close together, a patch of ground his father used to mow around, but never over. Frank followed slowly, boots sinking into the soft earth. The air there was different still, almost heavy, like the world held its breath. Ranger stopped at the base of an old birch tree, its trunk wide and pale against the dark soil. He began to dig claws, slicing into the ground with quiet urgency. Frank crouched beside him, brushing away the loose dirt. After a few inches, something metallic caught the light. He reached down, fingers closing around a small tin box, the kind that once held nails or screws. It was rusted at the corners, but still sealed tight. He hesitated, then pried it open. Inside was a small bundle wrapped in faded cloth. The smell that rose was faint, musty with age. Carefully he unfolded it. A lock of light brown hair tied with a ribbon that had once been pink, a tiny heart-shaped pendant, tarnished but still delicate, and beneath them a folded piece of paper, edges yellowed and soft. The handwriting was his father's. "Evelyn, I buried her near where she loved to play. Please don't tell the boy. He doesn't need to know. Let him keep what's left of peace. I'll take the rest with me." The words blurred as Frank's eyes filled. He closed the box slowly, pressing his thumb against the cold metal. Ranger sat beside him, breathing softly, his body still, as if even he understood the gravity of what they had found. The earth smelled of rain and rust and something older, something sacred. Frank looked around at the trees, remembering summer afternoons when he and Annie had played here building forts, pretending the birch grove was a castle. He could almost hear her laughter blending with the wind. The sound hit him like a wave. He sat back hard, his breath unsteady. For a long time he didn't move. The box sat between them, small enough to fit in one hand, heavy enough to hold a lifetime. He whispered, "You didn't mean to bury her alone, did you, Dad? You just didn't know how to face it." The words came out hoarse, carried away by the breeze. Behind him, the sound of slow footsteps made him turn. Mrs. Reed stood at the edge of the yard, wrapped in her worn cardigan, a cane in one hand. She looked smaller now, framed by the gray sky, but her eyes were clear. "I thought you might come out here," she said softly. "Your mama used to." Frank blinked, trying to steady his voice. "You knew," Mrs. Reed nodded once. "Not everything, but I knew enough." She stepped closer, gaze fixed on the box in the grass. "She cried here every week. Same day, same hour. I'd see her from my kitchen window, just sitting under that tree holding something in her lap. Never said a word about it. But she always came." Frank's throat tightened. "And my father." Her expression faltered. He stopped coming after that first year, started working more, drinking more. Said the house needed fixing, said the land needed tending. But what he really meant was that the silence needed to be kept. She reached out, touched Frank's arm lightly. "They both loved you, you know. That's why they carried it. They thought they were protecting you." He looked down at the box again, the pendant glinting faintly through the crack in the lid, protecting me from what he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Mrs. Reed didn't answer right away. She just looked toward the lake where the clouds were beginning to part and sunlight broke through in thin rays. "From the kind of truth that never leaves you," she said finally. "The kind that takes root and grows quiet inside you until it's part of who you are. Your mother never forgave herself. But she forgave him in her own way. I think she forgave you two just for being the one who lived." The words hung between them, heavy and fragile. Frank couldn't find his voice. Mrs. Reed started back toward the house, her steps slow, the cane tapping softly against the ground. Ranger lay down beside the tree, resting his head on his paws. The wind moved through the branches above, and a single leaf fell, landing gently on the tin box between them. The house was quiet again, the kind of silence that doesn't rest, it breathes. Frank sat on the porch steps long after Mrs. Reed had gone, the tin box beside him, Ranger stretched out at his feet. The birch tree stood tall in the distance, the place that had held his sister longer than anyone should have to hold a secret. The truth was here now, solid as the ground under him. But something about it still didn't fit, as if one piece of memory had been filed away in the dark, waiting to be called back. He rubbed his temples, the ache there, dull but steady. The rain had washed the dust from the porch, leaving faint streaks across the boards, the same boards his father once nailed down, the same hands that had built the room, repaired the cracks, buried the truth. Ranger lifted his head suddenly, eyes fixed on the house. A sound came from inside, soft and rhythmic, the steady ticking of the old mantel clock, the one that hadn't worked since he was a boy. Frank frowned. He stood slowly, pushing open the door. Inside, the air was warm, heavy with old wood and rain-soaked earth. The clock on the wall ticked once, twice, then stopped again, as if remembering how to move. He closed his eyes. The sound shifted. The ticking became footsteps, small and fast. The air filled with laughter, Annie's voice clear and bright, bouncing off the rafters. He was back there, 7 years old again, sitting on the floor of the blue room, while Annie spun in circles, her dress flaring, the brass buttons catching light. Their father's voice drifted up from below, sharp, impatient. "Annie, Frank." Down here, Annie froze, the smile fading. She looked at him with wide eyes, whispering, "He's mad again." Frank remembered the smell, whiskey and sawdust, the two scents that clung to his father's clothes. "Hide the doll," she whispered, clutching the small wooden figure their father had carved for her. Its arm was broken. She'd tried to glue it herself, leaving a smear of blue paint along its shoulder. She shoved it under the bed just as their father's footsteps pounded up the stairs. "Annie." His voice cracked like thunder. The door burst open. He stood there, red-faced, breathing hard, holding the broken arm of the doll. "You lied to me," he said. "You told me you'd take care of it." Annie took a step back, shaking her head. "I'm sorry, Daddy. I didn't mean to." His father grabbed Annie's wrist, not hard at first, just enough to pull her forward. "You always lie," he said. "You always." Annie jerked away the loose floorboard, giving a groan beneath her feet. Then came the sound. A sharp crack, the splinter of wood, the heavy thud of her small body hitting the edge of the workbench that leaned against the wall. Silence followed. His father froze, eyes wide, the anger draining out of his face all at once. "Annie," he said, voice thin, disbelieving. But she didn't move. Frank remembered standing there, unable to breathe. The world had gone quiet, except for the creak of the house settling. Then his father turned, saw him, and something shifted in his gaze, fear deep and raw. "Go to your room," he said. Frank didn't move. "Go." His father's shout broke the spell. Frank ran, tripping over the doorway, stumbling into the hall. He didn't see his mother come home until later, didn't hear the argument that followed the crying, the hammering that went on long into the night. He only remembered the smell of varnish and something metallic like rust. The memory broke apart, and suddenly Frank was back in the present, standing in the middle of the hallway, sweat cold on his neck. Ranger pressed against his leg, grounding him. "I saw it," Frank whispered. "I saw it all." The realization came like a wave. He hadn't forgotten because time had faded it. He had forgotten because someone had taken it from him. He remembered the days after Annie vanished, his mother's calm, the way she'd made him tea, the faint bitterness of the taste. She'd told him it would help him sleep. He'd slept for days. When he woke, the police were gone, the room sealed, his father silent. He remembered asking where Annie was, and his mother had pressed his hand and said softly, "You don't have to remember, sweetheart." He understood now. She hadn't lied out of cruelty. She'd erased it to protect him, to keep him from carrying what she couldn't. The silence that had wrapped their family wasn't born of deceit, it was born of mercy. But mercy and truth rarely coexist. Frank leaned against the wall, the same one that had held the scratches, the faint outline of the words his sister had written. His breath trembled as he traced them again. "Don't tell Dad. Don't tell Mom. It hurts," he whispered. "I remember now, Annie." And for the first time in 50 years, the memory answered. The sky over Flathead Lake was soft gray by morning, the kind of light that held neither warmth nor cold, just a quiet kind of mercy. Frank sat at the kitchen table with a sheet of paper in front of him, the kind yellowed at the edges from years spent in drawers. The pen felt heavy in his hand. Ranger slept near the door, his breathing steady, his paws twitching in dream. The silence of the house was different, now lighter, somehow emptied of its threat. But still, there was something unfinished. The dead deserved words, even if they couldn't answer. He uncapped the pen. The first line came slowly written in the deliberate hand of a man who had lived too long with unsaid things. "Dad," he began, the ink trembling just slightly where the pen met the page. "I found her. I found what you buried, what you tried to hide. I know now it wasn't hate that did it. It was fear. You were a good man who made one terrible mistake, and you carried it until it killed you. I understand that now." He paused, staring out the window where the birch tree swayed in the wind, its pale bark gleaming against the dark soil beneath. "You wanted to protect us. You thought silence would keep me safe, but it didn't. It only turned me into a ghost who kept living. For 50 years, I thought this house was cursed. But it wasn't the house, it was the lie. I forgive you, but I won't hide her again." His throat tightened as he wrote the last words. "I'll tell the truth. For her, for you, for all of us." He folded the letter carefully, pressing the edges flat, then reached for the small tin box he'd cleaned the night before, the same one that had once held his father's tools. The box still smelled faintly of oil and metal, the scent of work and regret. He placed the folded paper inside, closed the lid, and held it a moment longer before standing. Ranger lifted his head, watching as Frank slipped on his jacket and opened the door. The air outside was cool and damp, the ground soft from the rain. He walked slowly to the birch tree at the edge of the property. The grass was still marked from where he had dug 2 days before. He knelt and set the box beside him. "You loved this spot?" he said quietly. "Mom told me you used to make mud castles here." His voice faltered. "I'm sorry. I forgot you for so long." He began to dig, each scoop of earth small and careful. Ranger lay down nearby, chin resting on the ground, his eyes never leaving Frank's hands. When the hole was deep enough, Frank placed the box inside, covering it gently with soil. His fingers pressed into the dirt, the cool texture grounding him, connecting him to the same earth that had held his sister all these years. He whispered, "It's done, Dad. You don't have to carry it anymore. I'll carry it from here." He sat back, breathing slowly, his chest rising and falling with the rhythm of the wind through the trees. Ranger got up, walked closer, and lay down again, this time right beside the spot, his head resting on the mound of freshly turned soil. His body was still, his eyes half closed, as though he too was keeping vigil. Frank smiled faintly, reaching out to stroke the dog's neck. The fur was warm under his hand, the heartbeat steady. "You found her, didn't you?" he murmured. "All this time, you knew where to look." Ranger's ears twitched a quiet acknowledgement. Frank looked up at the sky, the clouds thinning just enough to let sunlight break through in narrow beams. It fell on the birch bark, on the earth, on Ranger's fur, painting everything in soft gold. The warmth touched Frank's face, and for the first time in years he let it stay there. "You brought me back, old boy," he said softly. "You didn't just find her, you found me." The words caught in his throat, but they felt right. For years, he had been a man defined by what he didn't say. Now, the silence finally belonged to someone else, the past where it should have stayed. Ranger gave a small sigh, curling closer to the mound, his breath a slow, even pulse against the earth. Frank sat beside him, his hand still resting on the dog's back, the sunlight warming them both. Somewhere, deep in the woods, a bird began to sing the first sound of morning, breaking through 50 years of quiet. The next morning, the lake glimmered like glass under the pale Montana sun. The birch tree at the back of the property swayed gently, its leaves whispering as if repeating something too quiet for the living to hear. Frank stood in the doorway of the upstairs blue room, paint cans at his feet, the faint scent of primer already drifting through the air. The door creaked open, and the sound for the first time didn't carry dread. The sunlight poured in through the thin curtains, catching on the dust motes that danced like tiny ghosts in the air. Ranger lay across the hallway threshold, his chin resting on his paws, watching every move as if to make sure his human didn't turn back. Frank stepped inside. The room was smaller than he remembered, or maybe he had just grown too much for it. The walls were the same muted blue his mother had painted after Annie disappeared, covering everything like a veil. He reached up with the scraper, gently peeling at the old paint until the layers began to flake away. Underneath the wall was raw and uneven. His flashlight beam caught on the faint lines carved into the wood. He knelt down, tracing the marks with his fingers. They were smaller than he had imagined, shallow, uncertain. A child's hand had made them Annie's. The message still there beneath time and coats of sorrow. "Don't tell Dad, don't tell Mom." The letters trembled under his touch, the plea of a girl who thought silence could save her. Frank swallowed hard, his throat tight. "You don't have to hide anymore, sweetheart," he whispered. He sanded lightly around the words, but didn't erase them. He couldn't. He wouldn't. Instead, he reached for a small frame, the one he had found in the attic with his parents' photo still inside. He removed the picture, placed it aside, and fitted the wooden frame around the carved words. Then, with a steady hand, he dipped the brush into the pale blue paint and began to smooth it across the wall, not to conceal, but to renew. The color was softer now, lighter, the kind of blue that carried air instead of weight. Beneath the framed writing, he picked up a thin brush, dipped it in white, and wrote in careful script. "You can tell now." He stepped back, the brush hanging loose in his hand. The words gleamed against the sunlight, the blue walls breathing again after half a century of holding their breath. Ranger stirred padding into the room, his nails clicking gently against the floorboards. He walked straight to the window, sat down, and looked out toward the lake where the water shimmered under the sun. Frank smiled faintly. "Yeah," he said softly, "she'd like it, wouldn't she?" He imagined Annie sitting there on the floor, arranging her dolls, laughing about something small and ordinary. The house didn't feel haunted anymore. It felt awake. In the weeks that followed, Frank didn't leave the place. Instead of selling it, he began fixing what could be fixed: the roof, the porch steps, the rusted hinges that complained every time the wind changed. The neighbors came by, sometimes curious about the noise, and the lights returning to the long-abandoned A-frame. Mrs. Reed brought muffins one afternoon, and when Frank told her what he planned, her eyes filled with quiet approval. "Annie's Haven." She repeated the name, settling on her tongue like a prayer. It started small, one room cleared, then another. He reached out to the local shelter, offered the place to a program for children in foster care, those who needed temporary refuge, a space with warmth, safety, silence that didn't punish. Papers were signed. Volunteers came. The smell of fresh paint and sawdust filled the air again, but this time it wasn't hiding anything. Frank hung a small wooden sign by the gate, carved by hand, "Annie's Haven, a place to heal." The day they opened, he stood by the porch as a van pulled up, two young social workers stepping out with the first child. A little girl, maybe 7, clutching a stuffed bear that had seen better days. She looked scared, the way Annie once had. Frank knelt down, offering her a gentle smile. "You're safe here," he said. She nodded, eyes darting to Ranger, who wagged his tail slowly before lying down, his head on his paws, watching her with calm acceptance. She reached out, touched his fur, and smiled just barely, but enough. That night, when the house grew quiet again, Frank walked back into the blue room. The light from the hallway fell across the framed words, the white letters glowing faintly against the wall. Ranger lay by the window, his fur touched by the moonlight, filtering through the thin curtain, the same one his mother once sewed by hand. Outside, the wind picked up brushing against the trees, and for a moment there was a sound. A soft, lilting noise like laughter caught in the draft. It wasn't haunting, it was the sound of peace returning. Frank smiled, resting a hand on the old door frame. "It's all right now." "Annie," he said, "we told them." He turned off the light, leaving the room open, the door unlatched. The house exhaled the floor, settling the air, easing. For the first time since 1971, the Blue Room slept with its heart unburied. If this story moved you, hit like and subscribe to keep more stories like this alive. Which moment struck you most, the letter under the birch tree or the Blue Room reopening? Tell me where you're watching from.